The legislative chamber echoed with the gravity of the accusations as Representative Virginia Foxx initiated a rigorous inquiry into the administrative oversight of Minnesota's executive branch. At the heart of this tension was the staggering allegation that millions of dollars, originally earmarked for the federal pandemic response, had vanished into a web of deceit. Foxx maintained a relentless focus on the perceived failures of the state to safeguard taxpayer assets against predatory actors during a time of national crisis. She characterized the situation not merely as a bureaucratic lapse, but as a fundamental breach of the public trust that demanded immediate accountability. The governor sat poised, preparing to address the scrutiny of his management style and the specific actions of his departments. This particular controversy centered on a local non-profit organization that had supposedly served as a conduit for feeding vulnerable children during the height of the global health emergency. Foxx presented details suggesting that the funds intended to provide sustenance for the impoverished were instead utilized for the purchase of high-end real estate and luxury vehicles. Such claims struck a visceral chord with the public, as the imagery of children being deprived of basic needs while bad actors profited was politically explosive. The representative questioned how such a massive scale of fraud could occur under the watchful eyes of state regulators without triggering immediate intervention. Her line of questioning aimed to establish a pattern of negligence that she argued was symptomatic of the current administration's broader governance. Governor Walz, responding with a measured and professional cadence, sought to frame the issue within the context of the unprecedented chaos brought about by the pandemic. He argued that the speed at which funds had to be distributed created inherent risks that states across the entire nation were forced to navigate simultaneously. While acknowledging the severity of the theft, he emphasized that his administration was actively cooperating with federal investigators to ensure the perpetrators faced justice. The governor contended that the discovery of the fraud was a result of the state's own auditing processes, rather than an external revelation that caught them off guard. This defense sought to reclaim the narrative of competence, while acknowledging the inherent difficulty of managing a multi-billion-dollar relief apparatus. As the debate intensified, Foxx shifted the focus toward the intersection of state policy and federal immigration enforcement, a topic that has long served as a flashpoint in American political discourse. She scrutinized Minnesota's stance on cooperation with immigration and customs enforcement, particularly regarding the handling of undocumented individuals within the state's carceral system. The representative suggested that the state's refusal to honor certain administrative requests was creating a sanctuary environment that undermined national security and public safety. By linking fiscal irresponsibility with perceived weaknesses in law enforcement, she constructed a broad critique of the governor's ideological priorities. The room grew silent as the discussion moved from financial ledgers to the sensitive realm of sovereign borders and legal jurisdictional boundaries. Walz remained firm in his position, asserting that the state's primary obligation was to uphold the rule of law as defined by the Constitution and state statutes. He explained that Minnesota's policy of requiring a judicial warrant before assisting in federal removals was a measure designed to protect the due process rights of all residents. According to the governor, this approach ensured that the state's law enforcement resources were not overextended by performing tasks that are constitutionally the responsibility of the federal government. He rejected the notion that his policies were an obstruction, instead framing them as a commitment to judicial integrity and the prevention of unlawful detention. This legalistic defense was intended to neutralize the political heat of the immigration debate by grounding it in procedural necessity. The friction between the two leaders highlighted a classic American struggle between federal authority and state sovereignty, played out through the lens of modern crises. Foxx continued to press for a more aggressive stance, arguing that the failure to cooperate fully with ICE was a dereliction of duty that placed local communities at risk. She pointed to specific instances where she believed the lack of coordination led to preventable public safety issues. though Walz countered with data suggesting that Minnesota's crime rates and enforcement metrics told a different story. The back and forth served as a microcosm of the national divide, where data and anecdotes are often deployed to support diametrically opposed visions of governance. Neither side seemed willing to see ground, as the stakes involved not just policy, but the very definition of a safe and prosperous society. Throughout this opening segment of the inquiry, the underlying theme remained the stewardship of the public purse and the ethical obligations of those who manage it. Foxx's rhetoric was designed to appeal to the taxpayer's sense of fairness, highlighting the contrast between the hard-working citizen and the fraudulent entity. Walz's rhetoric, conversely, appealed to the necessity of systemic stability and the belief that the government must act as a shield for both the economy and civil liberties. The clash was not just over facts, but over the philosophical underpinnings of how a state should function during a period of extreme volatility. As the minutes ticked by, the complexity of the situation became more apparent, revealing that there were no simple answers to the questions being posed. The atmosphere remained professional yet charged with the invisible energy of a political battleground, where every word was measured for its impact on the upcoming electoral cycle. Foxx's team had clearly prepared a dossier of evidence aimed at putting the governor on the defensive, utilizing every minute of their allotted time to maximize the pressure. Walz, a seasoned politician, understood the optics of the situation and focused on maintaining a calm demeanor that projected confidence and transparency. This exchange was more than a mere legislative hearing. It was a televised performance of accountability in the digital age, where clips could be disseminated instantly to millions of viewers. The precision of the language used by both parties reflected the high level of professional training and the strategic importance of the issues at hand. In concluding this initial phase of the discussion, it became clear that the divide over the non-profit fraud and the immigration protocols was symptomatic of a much larger disagreement. Foxx viewed the state's actions as a sign of a bloated and unaccountable bureaucracy that had lost its way. Walz viewed the state's actions as a necessary and principled stand for the rights of his constituents and the integrity of the legal system. This fundamental disagreement set the stage for the subsequent hours of testimony, during which every detail of the pandemic relief program would be picked apart. The public was left to decide which narrative rang truer, the one of a state failing its most vulnerable, or the one of a state doing its best under impossible circumstances. The dialogue intensified as the focus shifted deeper into the specific mechanics of the financial oversight failures that allowed the Feeding Our Future scandal to manifest. Representative Foxx meticulously laid out a timeline, suggesting that the warning signs were visible long before the state took definitive action to halt the flow of cash. She argued that the sheer volume of the discrepancy, hundreds of millions of dollars, should have triggered automatic red flags within the state's accounting software. Under her scrutiny, the discussion moved from general policy to the granular details of departmental communication and the internal hierarchy of responsibility. The representative pointedly asked why the state continued to authorize payments even after the FBI had initiated an investigation into the nonprofit's activities. This line of inquiry was designed to highlight a perceived lack of urgency or, worse, a systemic indifference to the protection of federal resources. Governor Walz countered this by explaining the complex legal constraints that bind a state administration when dealing with active federal probes and court orders. He noted that the state did, in fact, attempt to stop the payments, but was initially met with legal challenges that complicated their ability to act unilaterally. The governor described a delicate balancing act where the state had to weigh its suspicions against the contractual obligations and the rights of the organization under the law. He maintained that his staff acted with the best information available at the time, prioritizing the continuity of services for children while the investigation matured. This defense painted a picture of a government operating within a rigid legal framework that sometimes moves slower than the pace of criminal enterprise. It was a narrative of a state trapped between its desire to protect funds and its obligation to follow the mandates of the judiciary. Foxx was not moved by these explanations, characterizing the legal hurdles as excuses for a lack of executive leadership and a failure of administrative will. She questioned the vetting process that allowed such a massive influx of capital to be managed by an organization that, in her view, lacked a proven track record of large-scale operations. The representative suggested that the vetting criteria were either non-existent or intentionally lowered to facilitate a rapid distribution of funds without regard for risk. This critique tapped into a broader skepticism regarding the efficacy of public-private partnerships, especially when they involve significant sums of taxpayer money. She demanded to know what specific changes had been implemented to ensure that a fraud of this magnitude could never occur again within the state's jurisdiction. The tension in the room was palpable as she pressed for a commitment to structural reform rather than just an acknowledgement of past errors. As the conversation pivoted back to immigration, the discourse became even more polarized, reflecting the deep ideological chasm that defines the current American political landscape. Foxx highlighted the North Star Act and other legislative efforts in Minnesota that she claimed were designed to shield non-citizens from federal authorities. She argued that such policies do not just protect the innocent, but also provide a safe harbor for individuals who have committed serious crimes. The representative contended that by refusing to communicate with ICE, the state was effectively choosing the welfare of foreign nationals over the safety of its own legal residents. This argument was framed in terms of law and order, suggesting that the governor's policies were a direct affront to the sovereignty of the United States. She cited specific cases where she believed a lack of state cooperation led to individuals remaining in the country who should have been deported. Walz responded by reframing the issue as one of community trust and the strategic allocation of local law enforcement resources. He argued that when local police are seen as an arm of federal immigration enforcement, immigrant communities are less likely to report crimes or cooperate as witnesses. This, he claimed, actually makes the entire community less safe by allowing criminals within those neighborhoods to operate without fear of exposure. The governor emphasized that Minnesota does cooperate with federal authorities when there is a clear criminal threat, but he distinguished between administrative detainers and judicial warrants. He asserted that his administration follows the latter because it provides a constitutional basis for detention that protects the state from legal liability. This distinction was central to his defense, portraying the state's policy as a principled adherence to the Fourth Amendment rather than a political statement. The debate then moved into the realm of fiscal transparency regarding the costs associated with supporting a growing immigrant population within the state. Foxx asked for an accounting of how much state revenue was being diverted towards social services, education, and healthcare for individuals without legal status. She argued that these expenditures were a hidden tax on the citizens of Minnesota, who were already struggling with the economic fallout of the pandemic. The representative suggested that the governor's sanctuary policies were an unfunded mandate that the federal government never intended for the states to carry. This line of questioning aimed to link the earlier theme of financial mismanagement with the current immigration policies, creating a cohesive narrative of fiscal irresponsibility. She demanded a more transparent reporting mechanism so that voters could see the true cost of the administration's ideological choices. Walz defended the expenditures by pointing to the long-term economic contributions of immigrant communities to the state's labor force and tax base. He argued that many of these individuals are essential workers in industries such as agriculture, healthcare, and manufacturing, which are vital to Minnesota's economy. The governor contended that denying basic services like education and healthcare would create a permanent underclass that would cost the state more in the long run. He viewed these investments not as a drain on resources, but as a necessary component of a functioning and compassionate society. His rhetoric emphasized the human element of the issue, contrasting Foxx's focus on balance sheets with a focus on community stability and moral obligation. This clash of priorities highlighted the fundamental disagreement over what constitutes a good use of public funds in a diverse and changing society. The interrogation then touched upon the role of the state's Attorney General and the level of coordination between different branches of the state government. Foxx suggested that there was a lack of internal oversight and that the various departments were operating in silos, which allowed for the exploitation of the system. She asked about the frequency of audits and the criteria used to select which organizations receive state contracts and grants. The representative argued that the current system was ripe for cronyism and that the lack of competitive bidding in some instances was a major contributing factor to the fraud. She called for a complete overhaul of the state's procurement and grant management processes to ensure a higher level of scrutiny. This part of the discussion was particularly technical, involving the nuances of state administrative law and the protocols for interagency communication. In response, Walz detailed the steps his administration had already taken to tighten the belt on financial oversight and improve interdepartmental cooperation. He mentioned the creation of new task forces and the implementation of more rigorous reporting requirements for any organization receiving state or federal pass-through funds. The governor insisted that his administration was being proactive in learning from the failures, and that the recovery of stolen funds was a top priority. He pushed back against the characterization of his government as disorganized, instead describing it as a large and complex machine that was constantly being refined. This defense was aimed at reassuring the public that the ship of state was being steered with a steady hand despite the storms of controversy. He positioned himself as a pragmatic leader who was more interested in solving problems than in engaging in partisan finger-pointing. As this segment concluded, the overarching conflict remained unresolved, a battle between two different philosophies of governance and accountability. Foxx continued to paint a picture of a state in disarray, where taxpayer money was being squandered and federal laws were being ignored. Walz continued to present a picture of a state that was compassionate, legally sound, and committed to the long-term well-being of all its residents. The dialogue had become a showcase for the contrasting ways in which Americans perceive the role of the state in the 21st century. The complexity of the issues, ranging from pandemic relief to border security, ensured that there would be no easy consensus. Both leaders remained entrenched in their positions, preparing for the next round of questions that would undoubtedly delve even deeper into the heart of the controversy. The interrogation intensified as Representative Foxx probed the structural integrity of the Minnesota Department of Education, questioning how such a massive financial breach could persist despite multiple internal warnings. She specifically highlighted the Feeding Our Future case, noting that the organization had managed to scale its operations to hundreds of millions of dollars with remarkably little pushback from state regulators. Foxx pointed to the department's decision to resume payments voluntarily even after raising initial concerns, suggesting this move indicated a lack of administrative backbone. The representative argued that by failing to maintain a hard line against suspicious grant applications, the state effectively signaled to bad actors that the system was ripe for exploitation. She demanded a detailed explanation for why the governor's administration seemingly prioritized the rapid disbursement of cash over the fundamental duty of protecting the public purse from organized theft. Governor Walz responded by detailing the immense pressure placed on state agencies during the pandemic to ensure that hunger did not become a secondary crisis to the virus itself. He explained that the federal government, through the USDA, had issued broad waivers that significantly lowered the barriers to entry for meal distribution programs. This environment, while intended to be compassionate, created a unique vulnerability that sophisticated criminal networks were able to exploit with alarming speed. The governor asserted that once the state identified clear evidence of fraud, They did not just sit idle, but instead engaged the FBI to build a comprehensive case that would lead to actual convictions. He framed the state's continued payments not as a sign of weakness, but as a strategic necessity to avoid tipping off suspects while federal investigators gathered the proof needed for a massive sweep. This defense did little to satisfy Foxx, who countered that the state's primary responsibility was to the taxpayers of Minnesota and the nation, not to the convenience of a federal investigation. She argued that every day the state continued to cut checks to known fraudsters was another day that children went without the support they were actually entitled to receive. The representative characterized the administration's narrative as an attempt to retroactively justify a period of profound negligence that had resulted in the largest pandemic fraud in the nation. She questioned whether the state had truly caught the fraud early, as the governor claimed, or if they had simply been forced to react once the scale of the theft became impossible to ignore. This line of questioning sought to dismantle the governor's image as a proactive leader, replacing it with the image of an executive whose departments were overwhelmed and under-equipped. The conversation then pivoted back to the controversial North Star Act and the state's broader policies regarding non-cooperation with federal immigration officials. Foxx highlighted specific instances where the state's refusal to honor ICE detainers supposedly allowed individuals with violent criminal backgrounds to remain in the community. She argued that the governor's rhetoric, which she characterized as hostile toward federal law enforcement, was creating a culture of lawlessness that transcended immigration status. The representative suggested that by comparing ICE agents to historic Gestapo tactics, the governor was actively inciting a lack of respect for the uniform and the law itself. She demanded to know if the governor felt any personal responsibility for the crimes committed by individuals who were in state custody but were released despite federal requests for their detention. Walz remained steadfast, insisting that his comments were aimed at the tactics used by the federal government under the previous administration, which he argued often disregarded the civil rights of residents. He emphasized that Minnesota's law enforcement agencies are committed to public safety but must operate within the boundaries of the state's own legal and constitutional framework. According to the governor, the state's policy is not about protecting criminals, but about ensuring that local police are not viewed as a threat by the communities they are sworn to serve. He argued that a sanctuary philosophy actually enhances public safety by encouraging immigrant families to report crimes and interact with local authorities without the looming fear of deportation. This perspective presented a fundamentally different vision of law and order, one based on community trust rather than a strict, top-down enforcement of federal administrative requests. The debate moved into the specifics of how the state manages the intersection of criminal justice and immigration status for those already convicted of crimes. Foxx asked for clarification on whether the state notifies ICE when a non-citizen is nearing the end of a prison sentence for a serious felony. She argued that the failure to coordinate such releases was a direct threat to the public, as it allowed dangerous individuals to disappear into the population. The representative pointed to several high-profile cases where she believed a simple phone call between state and federal officials could have prevented further victimization. She accused the governor of prioritizing political ideology over the basic safety of Minnesota's neighborhoods. This part of the exchange was particularly heated, as it touched on the visceral fears of the public regarding crime and the perceived failures of the justice system. Walz countered by stating that the state follows all mandatory reporting requirements but maintains a firm line on voluntary cooperation that lacks a judicial basis. He argued that the federal government has its own tools and resources to track individuals, and that the state should not be expected to do the work of federal agents at the expense of local priorities. The governor also noted that many of the individuals mentioned in the debate were long-term residents with complex legal histories that required a nuanced approach. He rejected the black-and-white framing of the issue, suggesting that the reality of immigration enforcement is far more complicated than political soundbites suggest. His goal was to portray the administration's policies as a balanced approach that respects both the law and the human dignity of all people residing in the state. As the discussion progressed, the focus turned toward the financial costs associated with these policy decisions, specifically the burden on the state's social safety net. Foxx argued that the governor's invitation to undocumented immigrants was creating an unsustainable demand on public schools, emergency rooms, and housing programs. She cited figures suggesting that the cost of providing services to non-citizens was reaching into the billions. Money, she argued, should be spent on legal residents and struggling veterans. The representative characterized this as a form of fiscal malpractice, where the governor was essentially spending other people's money to fulfill a personal political agenda. She called for a full audit of all state expenditures related to the immigrant population to provide taxpayers with the transparency they deserved. In his rebuttal, Walz pointed to the vital role that immigrants play in Minnesota's economy, especially in sectors that are currently facing severe labor shortages. He argued that without the contributions of these communities, the state's agricultural and manufacturing industries would face a crisis of production. The governor contended that providing basic services like education and healthcare is an investment in the state's future, as the children of immigrants will become the next generation of Minnesota's workforce. He viewed the costs not as a drain, but as a necessary part of maintaining a vibrant and growing economy. This clash of economic theories underscored the deeper divide between a nationalist, taxpayer-focused worldview and a more globalist, community-integrated approach to state governance. The final portion of this segment touched on the role of non-profit organizations in bridging the gap between state services and the immigrant community. Foxx suggested that the same lack of oversight that allowed the Feeding Our Future fraud to occur was also present in the state's funding of various immigrant advocacy groups. She raised concerns that taxpayer dollars were being used to fund organizations that actively coach individuals on how to evade federal law. The representative demanded a review of all state grants to ensure that public money was not being used to undermine the sovereignty of the United States. This line of inquiry brought the two main themes of the hearing, financial fraud and immigration, into a single, unified critique of the governor's administration. It set the stage for a final showdown in the subsequent sessions, where the details of specific grants and policy memos would be scrutinized under the legislative microscope. The hearing room's atmosphere grew even more restrictive as Representative Foxx introduced internal state documents that seemed to contradict the governor's previous public statements regarding the judicial timeline of the Feeding Our Future case. She focused on the controversial period in early 2021 when the Minnesota Department of Education resumed payments to the nonprofit after an initial suspension. Foxx pointed out that while the governor had previously blamed a court order for this resumption, the judge involved had later issued a rare public clarification stating no such order ever existed. This discrepancy, she argued, suggested a deliberate attempt by the administration to shift blame away from its own decision-making process. The representative characterized the department's choice to voluntarily resume funding, despite knowing of serious deficiencies, an act of administrative cowardice that directly facilitated the continued theft of federal resources. Governor Walz addressed these allegations by clarifying the immense legal pressure his staff felt under the threat of a civil rights lawsuit filed by the nonprofit. He explained that Feeding Our Future had strategically accused the state of racial discrimination, a charge that carried significant weight and necessitated a careful legal response. According to the governor, the decision to resume payments was not a sign of negligence but a calculated move to avoid a protracted legal battle that the state's attorneys believed they might lose based on the broad federal pandemic guidelines. He maintained that the department was working behind the scenes with the FBI during this time, and that shutting down the spigot prematurely could have compromised a much larger criminal investigation. This defense sought to frame the administration as a participant in a high-stakes sting operation, rather than a passive observer of a massive fraud. Foxx remained unconvinced, arguing that the fear of being labeled racist had essentially paralyzed the state's oversight functions and allowed criminals to walk away with nearly $250 million. She suggested that this culture of caution was a direct result of the governor's own political priorities, which she claimed emphasized social optics over fiscal reality. The representative pushed for an admission that the state's vetting processes were fundamentally broken, particularly regarding the approval of hundreds of new meal sites in a matter of weeks. She asked why no state employees had faced disciplinary action for failing to verify the existence of these sites, many of which turned out to be ghost locations that served no one. This line of questioning aimed to establish that the fraud was not just the result of clever criminals, but of a systemic failure within the state's executive agencies. The discussion then took a sharp turn toward the specifics of state-level immigration mandates and their impact on federal law enforcement operations. Foxx highlighted reports that Minnesota state officials had allegedly instructed local law enforcement to ignore ICE requests, even in cases involving non-citizens with prior criminal records. She argued that this was not a matter of community trust, but a clear violation of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, which establishes federal law as the supreme law of the land. The representative questioned how the state could justify using taxpayer resources to provide legal aid to individuals fighting deportation, while simultaneously failing to properly monitor its own social service programs. She characterized the governor's policies as a two-tier system of justice, where legal residents are held to one standard and those in the country illegally are shielded from accountability. Walz defended his administration's stance by reiterating that the state's resources are best used to address local public safety priorities, rather than acting as a force multiplier for federal agencies. He argued that the state does not have a blank check to perform federal tasks, and that any detention of an individual must be backed by a judicial warrant to avoid potential civil rights violations. The governor pointed to the fact that several Minnesota counties had recently been placed on a federal sanctuary watch list, which he dismissed as a political maneuver intended to distract from the federal government's own failure to pass comprehensive immigration reform. He asserted that Minnesota is a law-abiding state that simply chooses to prioritize the safety and privacy of its residents over what he called unfunded federal mandates. This response was designed to shift the burden of proof back onto the federal government for its perceived inability to manage the border effectively. The interrogation then delved into the financial impact of the governor's recent executive actions, specifically those expanding state-funded healthcare and tuition assistance to undocumented residents. Foxx argued that these benefits acted as a magnet for illegal immigration, placing an unfair burden on Minnesota's social infrastructure. She presented data suggesting that the influx of new arrivals was straining the budgets of local school districts and increasing wait times at community health centers. The representative suggested that the governor was virtue signaling with taxpayer money while the state's actual citizens were facing rising costs of living and a decline in public services. She demanded a transparent accounting of how many non-citizens were currently receiving state benefits and what the projected cost of these programs would be over the next decade. Walz countered these concerns by highlighting the economic necessity of an immigrant workforce in a state with a rapidly aging population and a critical shortage of workers in key industries. He argued that denying basic healthcare and education to any segment of the population is both morally wrong and economically short-sighted, as it leads to higher emergency room costs and a less productive society. The governor maintained that the contributions of immigrants, through sales taxes, property taxes, and labor, far outweigh the costs of the services they receive. He framed the debate not as a choice between citizens and non-citizens, but as a choice between a declining state and a vibrant, growing community. This philosophical disagreement underscored the two leaders' competing visions for the future of the state and the nation. As the hearing moved toward the topic of transparency, Foxx accused the governor of withholding documents that were vital to the committee's investigation into the Feeding Our Future scandal. She noted that her committee had issued subpoenas for internal communications between the governor's office and the Department of Education, many of which had been heavily redacted or not produced at all. The representative suggested that this lack of cooperation was a clear sign of a cover-up intended to protect the governor's political career. She warned that the committee would use all available legal means to compel the production of these records, including potential contempt of Congress proceedings. This part of the exchange highlighted the growing tension between the legislative branch's oversight role and the executive branch's claim of privilege. In response, Walz insisted that his administration had provided thousands of pages of documents and that any redactions were made to protect sensitive legal information or active criminal investigations. He accused the committee of conducting a politically motivated fishing expedition designed to generate headlines during an election year. The governor argued that he had been more transparent than many of his predecessors, and that he was fully committed to ensuring that those responsible for the fraud were brought to justice. He positioned himself as a leader who was being unfairly targeted for administrative failures that were global in scope, rather than specific to Minnesota. This defense was intended to appeal to a sense of fair play and to portray the hearing as a partisan theater rather than a serious inquiry. The session concluded with a focus on the future of oversight in Minnesota, with Foxx calling for an independent audit of all federal funds distributed by the state since the beginning of the pandemic. She argued that the Feeding Our Future scandal was likely just the tip of the iceberg, and that other programs were likely rife with similar levels of waste and fraud. The representative emphasized that the American people deserve to know how their money is being spent, and that there must be consequences for those who allow it to be stolen. This final push for accountability set the stage for the final segment of the hearing, where the discussion would turn to the broader implications of these policies for the country as a whole. Both sides prepared for a final exchange that would encapsulate the deep-seated divisions over governance, ethics, and the rule of law. The final chapter of this high-stakes legislative confrontation reached a crescendo as the focus shifted toward the long-term ramifications of Minnesota's governance on national policy. Representative Foxx argued that the Minnesota model under Governor Walz served as a cautionary tale for the rest of the country, illustrating the dangers of unchecked administrative growth combined with ideological rigidity. She maintained that the Feeding Our Future scandal was not merely an isolated incident of criminal ingenuity, but the logical conclusion of a system that treats taxpayer money as an inexhaustible resource. Foxx asserted that when a state intentionally creates barriers to federal immigration enforcement while simultaneously failing to police its own financial programs, it abdicates its fundamental duty to the American people. The representative's closing line of inquiry demanded to know if the governor would support federal legislation to mandate stricter oversight of state-administered federal grants. Governor Walz, maintaining his measured and resilient posture, used his closing statements to defend the spirit of generosity that he believes defines his state. He argued that the failures identified in the meal program were being used as a political cudgel to dismantle social safety nets that provide a vital lifeline to millions. The governor contended that while mistakes were made in the haste of a global emergency, the answer is to refine the systems of oversight rather than to retreat into a philosophy of suspicion and exclusion. He rejected the premise that his immigration policies were at odds with national security, instead framing them as a commitment to the constitutional principle that local governments are not mere appendages of federal agencies. Walz emphasized that Minnesota would continue to lead with a people-first approach, prioritizing the health and education of all its residents regardless of the political headwinds in Washington. The debate then moved into the granular territory of the North Star Act and its specific implications for interagency information sharing. Foxx presented evidence from local law enforcement officials who claimed they were being muzzled by state mandates, preventing them from reporting dangerous individuals to federal authorities. She argued that this was a direct violation of the public safety oath taken by these officers and created an environment where predators could hide in plain sight. The representative suggested that the state's refusal to honor ICE detainers without a judicial warrant was a legalistic smokescreen designed to provide political cover for a sanctuary agenda. She demanded a commitment from the governor to review these policies to ensure that loopholes for criminals were not being inadvertently codified into state law. This part of the exchange highlighted the deep-seated friction between local law enforcement autonomy and executive branch directives. Walz responded by pointing to the success of Minnesota's integrated approach to community policing, which he credited with building stronger bonds between the police and immigrant neighborhoods. He argued that when residents do not fear that a routine interaction with a local officer will lead to deportation, they are far more likely to serve as witnesses and report local gang activity. The governor maintained that the state's policies are designed to protect the sanctity of the home and the workplace from federal overreach that he characterized as often arbitrary and disruptive. He stood by the requirement for judicial warrants, asserting that this process ensures a level of constitutional scrutiny that prevents the wrongful detention of legal residents and citizens. This defense was centered on the idea that true public safety is built on a foundation of mutual trust and due process rather than just aggressive enforcement tactics. The interrogation then turned toward the broader economic impact of the state's fiscal decisions, specifically the potential for long-term tax insolvency due to expanded social benefits. Foxx argued that the combination of massive fraud losses and the rising costs of providing services to non-citizens would eventually lead to a taxpayer exodus from Minnesota. She cited projections showing that the state's high tax burden was already driving high-income earners and business owners to relocate to states with more conservative fiscal policies. The representative characterized the governor's agenda as a race to the bottom that would leave the state with a hollowed-out economy and an unsustainable debt load. She called for a moratorium on any new state-funded benefits for non-citizens until a full forensic audit of the state's pandemic-era spending was completed and the results were made public. Walz countered this doomsday narrative by pointing to Minnesota's consistently high rankings in quality of life, workforce productivity, and economic innovation. He argued that the state's investments in human capital, including its immigrant population, are precisely what make it a competitive and attractive place for modern industries. The governor contended that a starve-the-beast approach to government would only lead to crumbling infrastructure and a less educated workforce, which would be far more damaging to the economy than the costs of social services. He viewed the tax system as a tool for creating a level playing field where every child, regardless of their background, has a chance to succeed. This fundamental disagreement over the return on investment of government spending served as the philosophical bedrock of the entire hearing. As the clock wound down, the discussion touched upon the role of the media and the public's perception of government accountability in the digital age. Foxx accused the governor of using sophisticated PR maneuvers to deflect from the severity of the oversight failures, noting the administration's reliance on carefully curated press releases. She argued that the public deserves unvarnished truth, and that the governor's refusal to answer certain questions directly was a disservice to the voters who put him in office. The representative warned that the committee would continue its investigation until every dollar of the stolen pandemic funds was accounted for and those responsible at the administrative level were held to account. This final warning was a signal that the legislative branch intended to keep the pressure on the Minnesota executive branch for the foreseeable future. Walz, in a final act of political theater, invited the committee members to visit Minnesota and see firsthand the resilience and success of the programs they were criticizing. He argued that it is easy to criticize from a hearing room in D.C., but much harder to govern a diverse and dynamic state during a period of national crisis. The governor maintained that he was proud of his record and that he would not be intimidated by partisan investigations into abandoning his core principles. He positioned himself as a defender of the little guy against what he called political opportunists, who are more interested in scoring points than in solving the complex problems of immigration and fiscal oversight. This closing posture was intended to resonate with his base and to portray him as a leader who remains undeterred by the noise of the Capitol. The session concluded with a stark realization. The divide between these two visions of governance is not likely to be bridged by a single hearing or even a series of investigations. Foxx left the room with a stack of documents she promised would lead to further subpoenas, while Walz left with a defiant message of state sovereignty and social compassion. The public was left with a complex and often contradictory set of facts, where justice and fairness were defined in diametrically opposed ways. The Feeding Our Future scandal and the North Star Act will likely remain central themes in the ongoing national debate over how to balance the books while also balancing the scales of justice. This hearing served as a high-definition snapshot of a country struggling to find its footing in a post-pandemic world defined by fiscal anxiety and demographic change. The final moments of the transcript capture the gavel falling, ending a day of intense scrutiny that began with a focus on stolen lunch money and ended with a debate over the very soul of the American legal system. Foxx's parting words emphasized accountability, while Walz's final remarks focused on community, leaving the audience to ponder which value should take precedence in the years to come. The record remains open, as both sides continue to litigate these issues in the courts, the halls of Congress, and the court of public opinion. It is a story of a state, a nation, and the enduring challenge of maintaining integrity in the face of immense pressure. The documentation of this exchange will undoubtedly serve as a primary source for historians looking back on this volatile era of American politics.